right, welcome back to the Life, Liberty, and Pursuit of Happiness Project. Today I have with me author Lars Hedbor. He is a prolific author, writing about mostly the American Revolution, and he is someone who I have a lot of respect for, has a lot of varied interests, and I think will be someone that you would enjoy hearing about and hearing from. So, Lars, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
I'm very pleased to have you. So, as by way of introduction, I stole this from the media section on Lars's website because this about me stuff is better than what I was going to try and write for an introduction. So, what it says here is what made the American colonists turn their back on their king and fight for independence? How were they different from us, and how were their hopes and fears familiar to our own hearts? These are the sorts of questions that Hedbor thinks are important to ask in examining the American Revolution, and in the pages of his novels, he suggests some possible answers. His first novel, The Prize, was published in 2011. He then published almost every year since then, making Hedbor one of the most prolific novelists of the American Revolution. He's also written extensively about this era for the Journal of the American Revolution, and has appeared as a featured guest on Emmy-nominated Discovery Network program, The American Revolution, which premiered nationally on the American Heroes channel in late 2014. He later appeared as a series expert on America Fact versus Fiction for Discovery Networks, and was a panelist at the Historical Novel Society's 2017 North American Conference. He's an amateur historian, linguist, brewer, cuckoo clock restorer, fiddler, astronomer, and baker. Professionally, he's a technologist, high school foreign exchange coordinator, marketer, writer, and father. His love of history drives him to share the excitement of understanding the events of long ago and how those events touch us still today. So, did you write that yourself, Lars?
A fair summation. I'm sorry?
Did you write that yourself?
I did, yeah.
Very well done.
Our favorite subject is always ourselves, you know?
Very well done.
Thank you.
So, there's a lot in there just to unpack in that introduction. So, I'm fascinated by all these different roles that you play, from historian and linguist to brewer, cuckoo clock restorer, fiddler. I didn't know about that one, actually. Astronomer, baker. You've got a lot of things going on.
You know, I like to keep out of trouble. The fact is that I have a broad set of interests because everything interests me. You know, I have a hard time understanding people who look out at this amazing world that we inhabit and don't feel just an overwhelming sense of curiosity about everything that they see. And we're fortunate in that we live in an era where we can indulge that curiosity and do it with you know, amazing resources. You know, I can literally do a Google search and learn how to repair the most obscure cuckoo clock mechanism, or how to you know, how to improve my bowing for my fiddle, or you know, what a prostitute in Havana in 1781 would have smelled like. That is an actual research question that I had to look into at one point.
Oh goodness. Writing leads.
Believe it or not, somebody had an answer. So.
I absolutely believe that. Writing leads us down some very interesting rabbit holes.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, the most recent book that I've published, The Siege, I was writing about the experience of being stuck in Yorktown during the American siege of Cornwallis's forces there. And as your viewers and listeners may recall, that was the final serious battle, final major battle of the American Revolution. And it was a really terrible siege. The British were trapped on essentially a peninsula with land forces on one side, American land forces on one side, joined by the French under Rochambeau, and then trapped by sea with the French fleet having blocked their escape. And so, the sorts of questions that I had to research in order to write that included, being able to find literally a day-by-day journal written by one of the German soldiers, one of the German officers who was part of the British force there, and getting that firsthand account and being able to incorporate details from that into my story, and projecting that onto how my characters would have seen the same information, because my characters in this book are on the American side. I do try to take a fairly broad view of the American Revolution because I think there are magnificent stories to be told from all kinds of different angles. The one that I've just finished writing that will probably come out sometime in 2021 is told from the point of view of a prisoner of war taken at the Battle of Saratoga. So this is a British soldier whose story I'm telling. And I got started writing that one because I came across, first of all, we hear about the big defeat at Saratoga. That was the first major battle in the American Revolution where the Americans won, and that was actually the battle that convinced the French to come and help us. So that was in Saratoga, New York, down near present-day Albany, and we all kind of hear, oh yeah, the British surrendered, and that's kind of where we leave it, and then we forget, well, those soldiers who surrendered, what happened to them after that? And I was writing a book about another prisoner of war a couple years ago, and came across this citation that explained that that whole army was held captive throughout the rest of the American Revolution. For the next 5 years, they were held captive, and they were marched from place to place all over the United States, all over what was then the 13 colonies. So they started out in New York. They were sent to Massachusetts, and then they were forced to march all the way down to Virginia, and it was called the Convention Army. And it was one of these things I was just like, oh my God, I never even heard about this before. Yeah. Of course, this army surrenders, something has to happen to them, but I just figured, oh, they got exchanged. No, they were held captive for the remainder of the war. Wow. Absolutely amazing story. And so to back up a little bit, what I'm trying to do with my series is I'm trying to write a book for each of the colonies or future states, and I'm trying to tell the stories of ordinary people, because there have been plenty of books written about Washington, about Jefferson, and now we've got Hamilton is very popular right now. Hardly anybody takes us to sit at the dining room tables and the kitchen tables of ordinary people as they struggle with the incredible events that were unfolding around them. And very few writers have let us see those struggles and see how the decisions that ordinary people made wound up shaping history. Even if the people involved didn't make it into the history books, those ordinary people are the ones who actually made the history happen. And so I think those stories are completely fascinating to explore. The other thing that I try to do with my books is I try to tell stories about events and incidents that we don't often hear about when in our classroom histories of the American Revolution. So I've got one book that's about a scientific expedition that took place right in the middle of the war, to go up to modern-day Maine, it was then part of Massachusetts, to observe a solar eclipse. And we have a wonderful letter from President Hancock to the British, to the commander of the British garrison up there, because that area had just fallen to the British in America's greatest naval defeat until Pearl Harbor. Okay, so that's a history that we don't even hear about.
Yeah.
And then in that context, we then have this scientific expedition that's taking place from Harvard. And so I put us there in the barn where the Harvard expedition sets up, and let us see that solar eclipse, that total eclipse, through the eyes of one of the farmers. And so, you know, I find these little incidents, these little stories, and then I also try to find points of view that we don't often get. So my book set in New York is it takes the point of view of the Iroquois nation, the Haudenosaunee, and the thing that most students of the American Revolution, or at least casual students of the American Revolution, don't necessarily get an appreciation of, is that the Haudenosaunee they had a confederation that had lasted for 300 years, and it was ripped apart by the American Revolution as most of the tribes, there was a confederation of 6 tribes, 6 nations. Most of them stuck with their longtime allies, the British, and 2 of them peeled off and joined the Americans. So I let us see that heartfelt conversation among the elders of the tribe as they make that wrenching decision to back the American side. And that's a perspective that I think is really important to understand, that our struggles affected many more people than just the colonists and the British. And the other thing that I think is important to understand is that the American Revolution was a global war. The final battle of the American Revolution, I haven't written about this yet, but I'm planning to, and I'm looking forward to it. The final battle of the American Revolution took place in India. It was the Siege of Cuddalore. And what happened there was you had a French colony and an English colony that, because France and England were at war over over the question of American independence, they ended up at war there too. And so after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, after the war was over, they had this battle there in India. And that battle was resolved when word of the end of the war reached them, which, of course, in the age of sail and at a time when information traveled no faster than the fastest horse, that sort of delay was fairly common. So, understanding that the American Revolution was not a simple question of good Americans fighting against bad Englishmen. It was not a simple question of it wasn't even a simple question of Americans fighting just for freedom. There were many reasons that Americans chose to fight. And some of those have been suggested by some contemporary historians that I find unconvincing. Having to do with the claim that Americans were fighting to preserve slavery. I don't find that convincing based on what I've read of the newspaper. I read the newspapers. I read the journals. I read the letters of the people who lived at that time, and that was not a motivation that they had. But they weren't all fighting just for liberty writ large. They were fighting for their own individual reasons in many cases, and sometimes those reasons were as simple as the very serious abuses of authority that the British representatives did indulge in. My New Hampshire book, which came out last year, explores one of those incidents that happened actually well before the revolution started, and it was called the Pine Tree Riot, which your New Hampshire listeners and viewers may be familiar with. And essentially what happened there was, so to give a little bit of context, America at that time was very heavily treed, a lot of really fine pine trees, particularly in the Northeast. And there was a declaration from the king that any tree that was suitable for use as a mast for the Royal Navy it became the property of the king, of the crown. And that was sort of regardless of any grant of land that you might have gotten. And what that meant was that you couldn't cut those down, and you had to work around them if you were trying to clear a piece of land or harvest lumber. And many Americans resented that, and that law was, for a long time, observed more in the breach than in in obedience. And then the governor of New Hampshire decided that he was going to crack down, and in cracking down, he fined a couple of loggers, and when they refused to pay their fines, he sent out his sheriffs to go and enforce the fines. And there was a riot at a place called the Pine Tree Inn, which is why it's called the Pine Tree Riot, where these men basically found where the sheriff and his deputies were staying, and burst in and beat them nearly to death, maimed their horses, and disappeared off into the night.
Wow.
Yeah, and that happened, I think, as early, I think it was 1771. So it was very early on in the sort of struggle between the Americans and the British. So, it's a lot of stories like that.
Yeah, for sure. That's yeah, that's really interesting. That final battle that you referred to in India, when did that take place?
1783, I believe.
Okay, wow.
So it was.
So really, I mean,
Yeah,
when we think of the American Revolution, we think of, 75, 76 was when it really kicked off, and then went, I think mostly it's considered done 79, I think is what most people consider. But really, it was a full decade there, it sounds like.
Yeah. I mean, there was conflict going all the way back to 1770. The Boston Massacre. I should know this, and I don't. I think that was maybe 1770.
Mm-hmm.
And there were various acts of civil disobedience and not so civil disobedience. There was the burning of the Gaspé, which was a revenue cutter that was burned in Rhode Island, and its commander was shot. And that happened well before Lexington conquered. And I would regard that as probably the first shot in the war, because anytime you're shooting at a naval officer, that's pretty much an act of war.
Yeah, that's a big thing.
That's kind of a big thing. And yeah, the battle, the war itself raged. And the other thing that we often forget or don't get taught is that for the majority of that time, it really looked like the Americans were going to lose. And I think most people who were on the ground during that time would have said, yeah, this is not going well. Almost all of Washington's dispatches to Congress are talking about how he's having to retreat and having to run to preserve his forces so that he can battle another day. Mm-hmm. And in the end, that turns out to have been a very, very smart strategy. He was basically using the land area that he had available to him to grind down the British, because he understood that the British had, at the end of the day, the British had a logistical problem because their supply line stretched all the way back across the ocean, whereas Washington's supply lines were much shorter. And obviously both sides were foraging, and sometimes both sides foraged, to use a polite term, for looting and raiding and taking what they needed. But when it came down to things like gunpowder and bullets and so forth. Britain had to bring most of those in. They didn't have local supplies, whereas the Americans did. So Washington made use of that to really, prolong the war and stretch it out and grind down the British to the point where when Yorktown, when news of Yorktown reached London, that wasn't considered the end of the war, but essentially Parliament got that news and said, we've been doing this for 5 years more, and this is the second or third major army that we've lost that has laid down arms and has been taken prisoner. This isn't worth it to us anymore. These American colonies are not worth the trouble. Let's let them go off and fail on their own, and we'll go on and we can ship all of our prisoners and so forth down to Australia. We don't need the American colonies for that, and they're costing us more than they're worth. And in the end, that argument prevailed. And of course, the other aspect of that, and I think this is something really key to understand about the American Revolution. In many ways, it was a war between European powers that took place on our shores, because the French and the Spanish and the Dutch all jumped in to one degree or another, and they had all had conflict long before the Revolution, and the Revolution, our War of Independence, was a continuation of that conflict in many ways for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. We don't hear about a lot of that. Mostly we hear about the French involvement on our side, but I can see that being a wider conflict. I know, we hear about the German mercenaries, the Hessians, that fought on our side as well. But I know you mentioned a little bit ago a German officer that's fighting for the British. So did they employ German mercenaries as well?
Well, the Hessians were almost all British soldiers. They were almost all fighting on the side of the British.
Oh, my mistake.
That's again, it's a complicated picture. We did have a few officers from various German powers, or European powers. Some of our most famous officers, foreign officers, were men like von Steuben, who was Prussian. That's modern day Germany. Of course, Lafayette. Kozestu, I'm mispronouncing his name. He was from modern day Poland. And then the name that I want remembered in that company that has been almost entirely forgotten is the Spaniard Bernardo de Galvez. Galvez, I wrote a book based in the colony of West Florida called The Wind. And the reason I wrote that is I found this story of the Spanish, how the Spanish saved the American Revolution, that we never hear about. And it is an epic, amazing story. And I've tried to do it justice. I'll lay out the basics of it. Galvez was the Governor General of Spanish Florida not Spanish Florida, Spanish America. He was in was then to New Orleans. And being there in New Orleans, he was in a position to help the Americans smuggle down the Mississippi, right past the British forts on the Mississippi. The British had intended to come east from the Mississippi and attack us from behind, essentially, negating that advantage that Washington was making use of that vast land between the ocean and the Mississippi. Galvez, quietly before Spain joined the war, did his best to assist us by permitting smuggling of American goods down the river. As soon as Spain entered the war, Spain did not ally with the United States. They didn't recognize us. They allied instead with the French against the British, which worked basically the same way, but there's a diplomatic difference there.
Sure.
As soon as that was done, he put together a force to go up the Mississippi and attack the British emplacements on the Mississippi. Just before he was going to head up the Mississippi, a hurricane came through and destroyed his fleet. So he went overland, took all 3 forts on the Mississippi. I think he lost 2 men. some crazy and used absolutely brilliant tactics to force the British out. And so by doing that, he prevented the British from coming overland. But he was not done. He set his sights next on what is today the site of Mobile, Alabama, Mobile Bay. There was a large fort there, Fort Charlotte, it was called at the time. And it just happened to be under the command of an old friend of his. But he didn't let that stop him. He assembled a force, put together a fleet. As they sailed into Mobile Bay, another storm came up. He lost a lot of supplies and actually had to wait for reinforcements from Havana before he started the siege there. We have a wonderful series of letters between him and the commander of the fort there at Fort Charlotte, saying, basically he's saying, okay, I've got you surrounded. You can surrender with dignity and honor. And the British commander writes back and says, no, I've got reserves that you don't know about, and just you wait, you'll see. And so Galvez writes back to him and says, I'm going to knock down one of the walls of your fort. And by the way, that column of smoke that you see over there, that's your house burning. Sorry about that, but I had to do it. Knocks down one of the walls of the fort, and the British commander says, okay, fine, you got me, and surrenders. So Galvez takes that part of the Gulf Coast. And now he's actually into British Florida. Florida at that time was 2 colonies. Both of them were British, and both of them were loyal. And again, that was one of those things where I got started writing this because I was at a dinner party of all things. And a friend of my father's approached me and said, so when are you going to write about Florida? I was like, Florida? Who ever heard about Florida in the Revolution? He says, yeah, it was a couple of colonies, and they stayed loyal. And so that's a great story. I said, okay. So as I started researching it, I found this story. So that left the last major British holding in Florida was at, oh crap, I'm forgetting the name of the place now. Oh, this is embarrassing. It's up along the Gulf Coast. It's a major city today. Oh heavens. Well, it'll come to me, I'm sure. Anyway, this is the major British fort, and so in order to attack it, he puts together a very large fleet in Havana. As they sail out of Havana, another hurricane comes up. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So this is 3 attacks, 3 hurricanes, 3 storms. Okay. This one actually sank about half of his fleet, and he had to give up and go back to Havana, limp back to Havana, the ones that survived. Killed a lot of people. That was it was part of a hurricane season that has been the most deadly on record in history. Wow. Because either that storm or another one, I'm not entirely clear on which one, actually hit an English fleet and a French fleet at sea and sank the majority of them, and killed like 20,000 people. I mean, it was wow. Horrendous. So yeah, I mean, this is not a small set of storms. These are major storms. But anyway, so the next season, Galvez puts together a new fleet, goes in and takes this last British fort, and winds up taking all of Florida, east and west, from the British for the Spanish, and they held Florida until we took it away from them later on in history. So we have this amazing story. This guy is personally heroic and brave, and we hardly even remember him. And I think that's a real shame. The only place that his name is really remembered is in the name of the city of Galveston, Texas.
Hmm.
And honestly, he should absolutely be right up there with Lafayette and von Steuben and all the rest. He was one of the major contributors to American success in the American Revolution.
Wow, yeah, it's
So
unfortunate.
telling that story, yeah, well, and that's what I'm trying to correct. It's actually, the timing of it was really interesting. Just after I wrote and released that book, Congress finally, 240 years later, finally kept the promise that they had made to Galvez to hang his portrait in the halls of Congress. And they also granted him honorary citizenship, which is that's something that's only been granted to a very few men over American history. So I don't think that my book had any part to play in that, but the fact that there is a growing awareness of Galvez was a nice coincidence with the release of my book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And you've done a great job answering. I was wondering, as I was looking at your books that you've written, I noticed you had one about Florida, and I looked that up. I'm like, that wasn't one of the colonies, or one of the 13. I'm like, wait a second. And I saw another one about Nova Scotia, and I'm like, now I know that one for sure was not part of the U.S. ever. So I was kind of curious where some of these fit in, and why you've kind of chosen to write about the different colonies, but I think you've really answered that very, very well. So you've got 12 books currently in the series. How
Right.
many do you expect to have when you're all done?
I don't have an actual count yet. It will probably be somewhere north of 20 by the time I'm all done.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Just because, as you noticed, I am taking an expansive view of the colonies that I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
talk about. Obviously, I'm going to get the original 13. I haven't gotten all of those yet, but I've written about Nova Scotia. I've written about West Florida. I've got a story that I want to tell in East Florida. There are magnificent stories to tell in throughout the Caribbean that I think are well worth exploring. For completeness sake, I will certainly find something to talk about in Quebec and some of the other maritime provinces in Canada. I'm pretty sure I'll find stories to tell. Maine, although it was part of Massachusetts at the time, I've told that separately from my Massachusetts book. And the Massachusetts book is the one that I just finished because the major action of that book takes place in Massachusetts, even though it is about a British soldier. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if there's a whole book to write about the action in India, but there probably is. That's one that will be very challenging to write, just because there's so much other history, Indian history, that I would have to really absorb and roll into that. I've studied some of it, and it's a very rich and very rewarding history to look into. But trying to tell a story around that without having the whole thing just be, remember this piece of history that you've never heard of before.